Hey everyone, welcome back to Theorem Apologetics. So glad you're joining us today. Today we are going to be responding to the Non-Alchemist, or alchemist, or I don't know. I have no idea what that word is. Talking about the problem of evil and some responses he made to Cameron Bertuzzi with regards to soul building and skeptical theism. So, Josh, what's up, man?
I'm doing great, thank you. It's an interesting day today, and let's hope it's good to start off the day with a bit of philosophy and Christianity before the rest of the day descends into absolute football chaos. But yeah, it's a good start.
Hopefully we'll talk about the Champions League final at the end, but I feel like we can't get too soaked into that at the moment. I'm curious. So you're in Hong Kong. It's 8 a.m. The game starts at 3 p.m. my time, which is 3 a.m. Hong Kong time. So in like 19 hours, are you going to stay up the whole way until the kickoff?
I have a few friends over for the night, so we'll see how it goes. We might play FIFA until 3 a.m. and just watch the match. But then by the time the match ends, it's 5 a.m. in the morning. So we might just either not sleep tonight or just see how it goes.
If you get like that United Villarreal game on Wednesday, though, it might be like 6 a.m. with like
I know. I don't want it to get into 21 penalty shootouts. I'll die. It'll be too nervous for me. There's no way on earth that penalty shootouts can possibly deal with that.
Maybe we'll talk about football at the end, though.
Yeah, sure.
The Non-Alchemist debunked, as Jono says. Jono's a really cool guy. And obviously, that's not the intention of this video. And this is I'm excited to respond to this video because I think the Non-Alchemist, he's a really cool guy. It's like one of my favorite skeptical channels. So, wait, we'll not pull that up yet. Before we get into this, Josh, do you have any like preliminary thoughts on like the problem of evil or anything you want to bring up before we respond to this video?
Well, I definitely think that the problem of evil is undeniably perhaps the strongest argument against theism in a various amounts of ways. Not necessarily in the logical sense, but perhaps the evidential and the emotional problem caused by the problem of evil is perhaps the strongest argument against God. And of course, normally when we talk philosophy, it's not necessarily, oh, we don't like appeals to emotion, but always that appeal to emotion, how to live your life always is a bit there. And sometimes I suppose the problem of evil would indeed be one of the strongest challenges, just because even if people aren't philosophically trained per se, like they could still interact with that problem and really feel how much that problem would apply and interact with their lives. So I think it is one of the biggest challenges that we face. And I'm not to say that I think there's a lot of solutions to it, but it's also something that we always have to keep in mind, that we're not only dealing with a philosophical problem, but it actually is a problem which people interact with and struggle with their lives.
Yeah, it's interesting because like with the problem of evil, you have like the logical problem, then you have like the evidential problem, and there's the emotional problem, and then there's like all kinds of different like families of arguments in the problem of evil, whether it's like evolutionary evil or moral evil, or there's so many different things. In this video from the Non-Alchemist, he meant it's just a very short, like 3-minute video. So we're gonna get into a little bit of it. So you ready to get this thing going, Josh?
Sure.
Let's do it. Great. If it loads, you know. Oh, my tab went everywhere. Apologies, everyone.
So it's always been of interest to me when Christians try and explain how they make sense of all the evil and suffering in the world. So in this video, I'm going to be looking at a few responses given by Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity. So let's see what he has to say.
One of the best reasons that theologians have offered is what's called soul building. Soul building says that without evil, we'd actually be losing out on the greatest goods. Have you ever forgiven someone that hurt you or had compassion on someone that was in pain? Now ask yourself, in a world with no evil in it at all, would you have been given the same opportunities to exemplify these goods and develop your character in these unique ways? The answer, of course, is no. So here's what I'm getting at. Taking away evil in the world actually means taking away the greatest goods.
So Cameron explicitly claims that taking away evil would take away the greatest goods. But on most prominent versions of theism, this is just nonsense. As philosopher J.L. Schellenberg explains, quote, "Every worldly good that permits or requires evil is greatly exceeded by a pure good of the same type existing in God prior to creation." This is interesting. What it forces us to notice and take seriously is that since, say, instances of courage and compassion presuppose evil or its permission, these goods cannot exist in God prior to creation, and yet God is then unsurpassably great. In other words, it's not at all clear that the greatest goods require evil, even on theism. But if we assume Christian theism, the problem just gets even worse. Because if divine persons can have an unsurpassably deep, loving, and good relationship without the presence or possibility of evil, then why couldn't human persons have some kind of relationship that would image that one and mirror after it?
Now you might be thinking,
All right, there's a lot of really good stuff here, and he brings up some really good points. So Josh, do you want to kind of start us off talking about him and what he says on soul building?
Well, I definitely think that you perhaps have one of the best responses to his points. I'll leave you with that response. But I do think that just generally about soul building, I think it's very often the case that people look at the soul building theodicy and say, well, why do we need that thing to reach a greater good? Or even sometimes I've heard some people say, and this is not necessarily the Non-Alchemist, I think that's how you pronounce it, but some people would say, well, surely not every time you have suffering, people do good. But then I like to view soul building as something where people have the free choice whether or not to do that good, and that the evil is just an opportunity or a stimuli for that decision of free will. So it's possible, I think, that you have soul building in a world where there's evil, and then everyone chooses to do evil anyways, but the soul building theodicy still works in the sense that at least that evil gives you a choice or a free choice to do good. And I always like to think that the greatest good is a relationship with God. So no matter what happens, no matter how evil the world gets, or no matter how many problems there is in the world, as long as it ends up with a relationship with God, that is the most important thing. And we do see it, like evidentially, that there is a lot of situations where people do come to God through evil. And I think that that demonstrates the efficiency or the usage of soul building and evil to bring people to draw closer to God. And that's kind of my thoughts about the soul building theodicy. But then, of course, there is the response that I think you make, and I'll just kind of outline it and then you could build on it, is the idea that, well, God and humans are not necessarily the same.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting here because I've been thinking about this the past few days. And one of the things I think I agree with him is, like, if we're God doesn't need soul building. Like, he's already perfect. So there's no need for soul building for God. But then I think the problem is we aren't God. Like, so there has to be so there's a symmetry breaker here. He talks about, like, the divine persons being in this perfect relationship. There's no need for soul building. Well, that's the Trinity. That's not us. Like, you know, like we have like God the Father, Son, and Spirit, and like God's like perfect, omnipotent, omnipresent, like things like that. So since God's like infinite and perfect, he's not going to need any soul building. Yeah. And the problem is we're finite and imperfect. So maybe we would need soul building. So these aren't symmetrical situations here. So I think the question then just becomes like, well, why would we need soul building? Because you could say, okay, well, you know, yeah, Zach, yeah, Josh, you're not members of the Trinity, unless you secretly are, Josh. So it's like, okay, well, why would God create any being at all that needs soul building? Because, you know, like, we're finite creatures that aren't like all knowing and all powerful. So I think it might be helpful to learn the hard way. Like, take, for example, like, I took this class in high school on leadership, and this was not related to like the problem of evil at all. We always would get like into these discussions with our teacher about like, what's the best way to learn? Is it to learn through someone telling you, don't steal, don't do it, like, you know, like lines wrong, things like this? Or is it best to learn through like actually experiencing these evils? And like everyone in my class said that you learn better when you experience these things. So I think that at least would lend some credibility to soul building, where, you know, at least in this hypothetical situation, it's best to learn through actually experiencing these things. When you look at like, say, like the perspective of like an infinite afterlife, this life's really just a dream compared to everything else that's coming. So a little bit of evil is now to help build like a soul for the infinite future. It seems like a pretty good trade-off, at least in my mind, because evils allow us to see like the consequences of our free choices. And since we are finite, we're going to need to draw closer to God's nature. Like, God isn't just trying to make us into like pleasure machines where we get maximum pleasure. He's trying to build souls, people that imitate him and are like him. So that's a few thoughts. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Josh. I have more, but I mean, I just spit a lot of information out there.
I think evil, I completely agree with you, is that evil is just so useful in how in personal development, in understanding ourselves and also understanding God. And what I mean by understanding God is that recently I've always felt like some irritants or some anger towards society and the people around me, because recently some people were spreading some, well, it's quite a while ago, but false rumors about me behind my back and stuff like that. And it wasn't perhaps the brightest or the best situation or the best form of rumors that could be spread about you. I mean, on the rank of how bad those rumors could be, it's pretty on the quite bad rumor out there.
Were they saying you were an Arsenal fan?
No, I mean, it wasn't that, but I mean, that would have been perhaps even worse than the rumors that spread about me. But, you know, I was really annoyed about that. And I was really annoyed about a lot of things about society. But then I realized that evil, that suffering, that pain actually helped me appreciate how much worse God must feel when we are absolutely destroying and defaming his name all the time, no matter how much he loved us and how much he cares for us by sending his son to die for us. And then half of the world, actually more than half of the world, goes around and just kind of turns away from him and hates him and spreads false witness and kind of spreads rumors, kind of just says bad things about him. And by understanding that and by seeing how much that evil, kind of how bad we react to evil could be compared to how God must feel about the evil in this world, you really start wondering, well, maybe that evil is, even if it serves absolutely no purpose apart from allowing you to appreciate the suffering of God, you might think it's actually quite worth it, in the sense that perhaps understanding evil and understanding the suffering of God would allow you to appreciate the sacrifice that what Jesus meant to be for Jesus going onto the cross to die for us. And by understanding that, I think it really helps you strengthen your relationship with God, because it further emphasizes the love of God and the relationship that you have with him and how strong how strong of a role he plays in your life. And of course, it also, apart from that, evil helps you learn, and I completely agree with you. And perhaps I could provide an analogy about the symmetry breakers. Imagine a teacher, your math teacher, gives you an exam, a really difficult exam about math, and you absolutely hate it. I really hate math. I
Sounds
really
familiar.
dislike it. And the teacher gives you a math test, and then there's a lot of suffering with it. And then you do the test, and then you improve from it. Well, I mean, of course you could say, well, why do we need to have the test? And it seems like this is the argument that the non-alchemist is making as well. If there exists someone who is perfect and doesn't need the test to know the material, then why do we need the test at all? But then that only applies to the teacher and not the students. And in the same way, I don't think the argument or the response of the non-alchemist responds to the soul building theodicy, kind of building onto your point.
Yeah, and I do want to say here, maybe some people argue this, but like I wouldn't say that the soul building theodicy applies to like every instance of evil. Like if you read about like say like the rape of Nanking, I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing it, but like like what the Japanese soldiers did in China in 1941, I believe, it's terrible, and it's like it's like listening to it is like it's just horrific what happened. And I don't think that happened because God wanted to help build souls of rape victims. Like I think there's other theodicies that we kind of look at for in terms of like looking at something like that. But I do think like with a lot of like ordinary sufferings and challenges, the soul building can be very fruitful. So all that to say, I think the soul building theodicy works for some things, but then it doesn't work for all. And I don't think like the non-alchemist isn't saying that that's all apologists say the soul building for everything. But then someone will be like, well, what about like the rape of Nanking? How is that soul building? And I would say, well, it's probably not. So maybe moral lessons for society to grow, but I don't think it was all like a good thing for the people that actually experienced it. So yeah, if you get what I'm saying there.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you are saying. I think all the theodicies kind of are parts of a puzzle which provide a full and complete response to the problem of evil and kind of the challenges raised by it.
Yeah, it's the theist's job, like with the problem of evil, like at least in my understanding, I don't feel like I have to explain every instance of evil. I just have to show problems and like poke holes at like the atheistic arguments. Swift C says your book is terrible, Josh. Don't ever read it.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
No, it's a great book, and I would grab it, but it's all the way over there and it's buried under a pile of books. It's a great book though. Highly recommend. But anyways, the only other thing I thought about here is like, I'm trying to imagine like, okay, let's just imagine like what a world without any suffering at all would look like. And it just seems like to me that a world without suffering, like if we just grow in this, like if we just start off perfect, it's not going to allow for distance between like us and God for us to choose him. Because like one of the reasons, like I think like it seems like evolution is true or something like it. Like one of the reasons that I see is like why would God use a process like evolution is like allowing for us to choose him. Like it allows for this separation where we can like man can choose to be with God. So I just don't know what a world without suffering would even look like with regards to him saying, like, why couldn't God just create a world like where we exist without any evil at all? Because things like courage and compassion are things that allow us to develop in virtue and become better. And like we talked about before, God doesn't need these things because he's perfect. And at least like my last thought here with regards to this first bit from the Non-Alchemist is like, it's just impossible for God to create another perfect being since he is the perfect being God. Like you have like the law of identity. So yeah, that's my end. Do you have any other thoughts here, Josh, before we move on?
I was just thinking about the perfect world scenario, and sometimes I think about that as well. But then there's always a question about, well, if you reach that perfect realm, would that not like pose kind of an end to history? Or how can, like, it seems that a perfect world would just mean that there's a lack of anything that you can do further. You cannot develop anything you've done because it's already a state of perfection.
Yeah.
Like a lot of parts about the human existence is not only about trying to move towards a certain aim or develop yourself, but it's also trying to keep on having a goal to do. But if you have a perfect world and everything that you want is already there, and everything you need is already there, and everything that you want to achieve is already perfect, then, well, I hardly see what's the point of life or what's the point of actually doing anything, because, well, whatever we do or whatever we try to achieve is already perfect. We don't need, there's no more motivation for us to do absolutely anything in life. And I think that seems more like an absolutely horrific world. In the same way, it is a perfect world because we have everything and everything is obtained. But also we have the horrific world, but it's also a horrific world because we can't do anything. We've lost all ability to improve ourselves, to move towards any direction. I think that's one of the biggest problems of a perfect world. And also, I think it's one of the main problems with some sense of communism, because like they're trying to propose a perfect society. Of course, that's kind of a kind of reduction of it, but they want to move towards a perfect society. But then when you reach it, then what? You kind of end history, and then there's nothing more you can do after that. So I think that's kind of my problem with a perfect world, is that the moment you reach it, you just can't go any further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing I actually just thought of, because I saw it in my notes, was like he talks about how like the problem is worse for like Christian theism because of like Trinitarianism. But I also wonder like if there's an explanation in Christian theism, because we have like the story of like the fall. Because I just remember this, like you have Adam and Eve and they're placed in Eden or created in Eden, and they're in this like, so to speak, perfect world where they are like in like seemingly, you know, like a perfect place or like a really, really good place. And even though they're in this place with very minimal or no suffering, they still choose to disobey God. So it seems like, at least in Christian theism, like at least in like the current human state, it almost seems like you can't, you wouldn't choose God even if you had the opportunity. So it seems like that just a little bit to me. Like it seems like that story kind of goes against this idea of like I just don't even know what a world would look like where all human beings just really choose to believe in God in terms of like dislike, because, you know, we have like heaven and such. But yeah,
I'll completely agree with that. And I also really agree with the point about looking at it from the lens of Christian theism, because I think ultimately you have to look at it from the Christian narrative. The problem of evil is pointed towards the Christian narrative. The best response is via the Christian narrative. And I think there's a lot of sufficient arguments against the problem of evil, and also ideas for soul building found in the Christian narrative. And that's a very good place to start off with.
Yeah. Well, if you don't have anything else, we'll get into this next bit on skeptical theism, if that works for you.
Sure, sounds great.
Let's do it. If it looked.
Be thinking that these goods pale in comparison to some of the bads in the world. You might be wondering, well, how does forgiveness outweigh child cancer? Now, I happen to think that humans in general are just really bad about weighing goods and bads with all the emotions involved and everything.
If humans are really bad about weighing all the goods and bads because of all the emotion involved, then I guess they would be really bad at critically assessing their deeply held religious beliefs too, huh?
Let's put that worry aside. Let's just
What do you think about that little bit there? He has a little bit deeper critique of like skeptical theism here for a second. But do you have any thoughts here, Josh?
I mean, I do have to say that I'm normally not a huge fan of sarcasm, and I don't think that was perhaps the best representation of perhaps the non-alchemist. And because I don't necessarily think that you can compare your lack of understanding due to emotions to you're able to understand due to good reasoning. I don't think there's necessarily a connect there, because I mean, there's a lot of things which I will completely agree, are as a result of emotion, and that emotion clouds your thoughts. But it doesn't mean that humans are fully emotional. I think that humans are emotional and very much emotional and perhaps less rational than most of us would like to think. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we don't have a rational faculty. And to say that, okay, some things cannot be understood, therefore everything cannot be understood, is not necessarily a very good argument. And I'm not exactly sure whether that's what the non-alchemist is trying to point to, because I think it seems more like a bit of a sarcastic, witty comment that he's making than a philosophical argument. But I definitely do think that if he did mean that as a philosophical argument, I don't think it's very good.
Yeah, I think it's just a little comment. But like in terms of like just like looking at it, like if we're gonna say like it seems like you'd almost like if we're gonna look at it as an argument, he's gonna say, well, it's symmetrical, where we say, well, we look at like the problem of evil, and maybe it's just like too hard for us to understand, or we can let our emotions get involved. Because like I was listening to like Emerson Green's Counter Apologetics podcast today. He was talking about like seemingly gratuitous sufferings, and like my heart was like heavy. I was like, these things are terrible. And it's true. Like, it seems like emotions do get involved in looking at like these gratuitous evils. Like, I'm not even like, so, and then you look at like, is it the same as like assessing our religious beliefs? And I just don't think it's not a symmetrical situation here. So I don't think there's any symmetry in what he's saying, which I don't even know if he's intending it to, but that's just kind of my thoughts.
Yeah, completely agree with you on that.
Awesome. Let's get into this next bit.
Assume that we can't think of a good answer to this question. Does it follow now that God doesn't exist? Still no. All that means is that we have a gap in our knowledge. That's it. Saying, I don't know why God allows child cancer, but surely God has a reason, is a completely legitimate answer. After all, there is a limit in what we can understand, so we shouldn't expect to know everything.
This kind of reasoning is broadly in accordance with what's called skeptical theism. And while it might sound intuitive on its face, philosophers have pointed out all kinds of problems that result if theists accept this kind of reasoning. The logic undergirding these claims has the ability to possibly affect our moral reasoning, arguments from natural theology, arguments from divine revelation, and certain religious epistemologies. For more on that, see the links in the description. As you should hopefully be able to see, a lot of common responses to evil just aren't all that they're cracked up to be. And as always, it's been fun.
Okay, I think that's the end of this video, because he's a cool outro, and that's about it. Josh, skeptical theism, what are your thoughts?
Well, okay, sorry, there's something a bit dodgy with my mic just now, but I essentially was thinking that I do think that from a logical perspective, skeptical theism isn't too bad. But at the same time, I think that there's so many other better arguments against the problem of evil that you don't necessarily need to go to the point of skeptical theism. And that's perhaps my main problem with the skeptical theism kind of position. And, you know, one of the biggest problems I think is by skeptical theism is it's not necessarily obvious that we shouldn't expect ourselves to understand evil. Not to say that there is a chance that we don't have the ability to understand. And I do agree that we do have limits to our knowledge. But at the same time, do I think that's a very convincing argument, or is that a very useful argument to say to someone who has a very big problem with the problem of evil? It just might not be the best way to counter both the evidential and perhaps the emotional problem of evil. If someone, it just doesn't seem very satisfactory by just saying, well, why should we expect ourselves to know when some guy's just seen absolutely horrible evil happening in front of him? Like, that's perhaps not the best response to go around doing things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would hold to a very, very limited level of skeptical theism. Like, at the end of the day, like, you know, like my knowledge and understanding is finite and God's is infinite. So like, I can't understand everything. So like, you know, like, let's look at something like, you know, like Rose Fawn, where like there's a fawn in a forest fire and it gets trapped and it dies slowly over a couple of days. Like, what's the good in that? Like, I wouldn't just adopt like full on skeptical theism here, because I think it's very unsatisfactory. Like, I agree with you, especially with responding to like people with regards to the problem of evil. Maybe if you're going to like just do like a philosophical argument, it could work more in terms of just like the paper of it. But I find it very unsatisfying in terms of just skeptical theism. So like, I look at like something like Rose Fawn and be like, okay, well, there's things like a knowable natural order. Evil is allowed for like the preservation of freedom. Something I was thinking about, actually, I don't even know if someone has this theodicy, but like one of the things people talk about is like, well, why is there all this animal suffering? But we lived in balanced ecosystems, which allow for billions of people to exist. Like, if all these animals didn't exist, all these people wouldn't exist. It would seem like we live in like balanced environments. So that's just a very new thought I had. It's like, it seems like to me, like when we're looking at like the problem of evil, at least in my opinion, it's about showing, well, here's all these plausible theodicies. Here's poking all these holes in like the atheistic argument. And I don't know exactly which one's correct, but I see all these plausible reasons why this particular suffering occurred. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that. I hold a very limited version of skeptical theism.
Yeah, I'll completely agree with that, and I do think that. Wait, I was going to say something I completely forgot about it. Oh yeah, about the natural order and the way the world works. I completely agree with that. I think that, I mean, at the end of the day, what we do see with animal suffering is it is a significant problem, but it also depends on, well, what do you see as the telos, or what do you see as the purpose of the existence of animals, or perhaps how do you approach, or how do you interact with the animal world, and it's not necessarily about soul building regarding that, or even any direct theology regarding that. And I think it's quite a new one, but I definitely see that if animals are truly there to kind of maintain a natural order, or they're there to like kind of not necessarily die and live and reproduce. I think that's perhaps a bit of a too simple understanding of the animal problem. But I do think that if you do have these animals suffering, and then you do have them dying, I'm not exactly sure how direct that comes to an all-loving God when the problems which cause those animals to die are a result of this natural order or this natural structure to the universe or to the world, which is absolutely integral for the preservation of life.
Yeah.
Or it's just absolutely vital for the development of their own population. And of course, sometimes you could say that some of the natural disasters are way more harmful and there's not like any good coming from them. Like you see the bushfires in Australia, like that goes over the boundaries and say, well, and it's not necessarily like you burn a bit of it and then like some plants grow back, because sometimes you do see situations where a bit of a natural disaster happens, and from that natural disaster, better things like naturally come out of it. You sometimes see like a bushfire, a small bushfire, or perhaps a bit of a weird situation happens in the animal world, and some animals die. Then because of that fire, there's perhaps more nutrients in the soil, or more different things, and then like a better society or a better animal colony arrives from that, and that's a very good thing. So and of course the extremes don't work here, but generally speaking, I think there's a few ways we can go around this animal suffering and these problems.
Something I just thought about. Well, first, Jono says, since we disagree with Bill Craig, we're terrible apologists and we should like quit. So there's that. But also, so in I think it was the Cosmic Skeptic Inspiring Philosophy debate on the problem of evil, Michael brings up to Alex, like, okay, well, you talk about all this animal suffering, and like think about the rainforest and like all the suffering that occurs in the Amazon. If the suffering's so bad, shouldn't we just destroy the rainforest? You know, because it's, you know, like we have like rose fawn happening, I'm sure, daily in the rainforest. And Alex is like, no, we can't do that because we need the rainforest. The suffering's there, it's terrible, but we need the rainforest. I could be totally remembering this debate wrong. But I think that's what Alex says. And I think the response then would be just like, well, then we need the rainforest. And like the suffering here, well, there's a purpose, and it's to keep life going, because the world kind of like works off of each other. And then the problem doesn't become like, why are there gratuitous evils? Because it seems like these sufferings aren't actually gratuitous. There's actually a purpose to the rainforest, and the noble natural order in the rainforest is it sustains human life. The problem just becomes then again, well, why is there just suffering in the first place at all? So I hope that made sense, because I just thought about that when you were talking with regards to like gratuitous evil and like talking about these things like rose fawn and such.
I completely agree with you on that. And that I don't think I watched that discussion about suffering between Alex and Michael.
It's a good debate.
I should check that out one day. But yeah, it's something which I have to put on my list of things which I should check out.
I have on my YouTube watch later like 700 videos. There's just so many things out there on the internet. So
yeah.
Jono says the last Aussie bushfires were wild. My cousin's whole farm was destroyed. That's terrible. That's sad. Australia. I want to go there sometime. Josh, any other like thoughts on like the problem of evil or anything like this? And then we'll talk about the actually important stuff of Chelsea Man City. But any thoughts on the problem of evil before we wrap up this little section here?
I mean, I think we covered most of what was said in the video, in the sense that we've covered most of, I think, the response of Non-Alchemist, and I think that, although I think we might talk a bit about his response to skeptical theism, which was kind of, what was his response to skeptical theism?
He didn't, like, we played through the whole video. I think he just kind of brought up like the idea that like, well, it seems like if we embrace skeptical theism, then like it seems like, well, how much can we really know about other things, like our own, like say like moral knowledge or like fine tuning arguments or things like this. And that's like part of the reason I'm very like skeptical of skeptical theism is like, if we're gonna say how much can we really know, well then like I have this argument from limits I really like. It seems like you could say something similar about that, or like the fine tuning argument or things like that. So I think that was like the part of it. He didn't get into too much detail on skeptical theism.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that skeptical theism is. I would completely agree with you. It's a decent thing to use on paper, but perhaps less so when you actually interact with it in regards to other things in your life, and it becomes a bit of a problem.
Yeah. I agree. If there's any questions, I guess, relating to like the problem of evil or anything like that, I guess we can answer a couple in the live chat. But this next section, Josh, Chelsea, Man City, what's going to happen in about 14, 16 hours here?
I was talking with my friends. I talked with my good friend on this topic. We did a match preview for the Chelsea match, and I have to say, I have to predict a Chelsea win because despite all the odds, I can never predict my own team that I'm supporting going to lose. Like even if you're going against Man City is the best team in the world at this moment, I can't go into a match predicting the team to lose. And there's what do you call it? There's a ad of Chris Hadfield, the Rocket Man, like the guy who went into space on YouTube. There's a masterclass, and he says something like, no one ever goes into space with their fingers crossed. You can't go into a football match with your fingers crossed and saying we are going to lose this match. You have to go into believing you can win it. So my score prediction for the match is going to be, it's very precise and very specific, and I know it's going to be wrong. But at the same time, I'm going to say that it's going to be Chelsea. Timo Werner scores the first goal in the first half. And then Sergio Aguero comes off the bench to score a goal in the second half, in the 80th minute. And then in extra time, Olivier Giroud scores a header to win the Champions League. That's my prediction, although I highly doubt that's ever going to happen. But if it does happen, you've heard it on it here at Apologetics, and we're going to be the biggest football predicting agency in the world.
Be proof of prophecy, and atheism will be debunked forever.
Exactly.
We'll have it done. Oh my gosh, I'm excited. I don't know what's gonna happen. So my hopeful prediction is Tuchel starts Pulisic. Pulisic balls out. He scores a goal in the 65th minute. Chelsea wins. Well, Timo Werner, he does something random every once in a while. So he'll score the second goal in stoppage time just to wrap things up. So 2-0 Chelsea is my hope. But in reality, City's so good. I just don't know. Like, oh my gosh. It's like, okay, Chelsea did good in the FA Cup, they beat Chelsea. Chelsea beat Man City. That was good. But then you look at they just lost to Leicester. They just lost to Aston Villa. Like, what's going on here? And I don't know. It's going to be interesting. So I'm excited.
Yes, I do think the losses to Leicester and Aston Villa were very worrying. But at the same time, it seemed that all our problems that we made in those matches were all kind of because of our own problems. We kind of made our problems for ourselves. Our defending was horrible, and we just had kind of like small lapses in concentration. But hopefully that doesn't happen for the Champions League final, and we can have a chance of winning this.
Yeah, okay. Well, fingers crossed. If the Lord is with us, Chelsea will win. We do have one question here from Jonah, which says, if we put the problem of evil in strictly Bayesian terms, is your position that extreme suffering is equally probable in atheism, theism, or is it favor atheism but get outweighed by other evidence? That's interesting. Do you want to go first or second, Josh? It's an interesting question.
First, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't really I don't really have a problem with saying suffering would be more expected under atheism than theism if I did believe that, because I think there's just really good arguments from natural theology in terms of all these different things. But I'm still not even convinced that it would be more expected under atheism than theism. Because it seems to me any particular instance of suffering, as I understand, I think there's plausible theodicies. I don't think we have a concrete understanding, but from rose fawns to a horrific thing what happened in Nanking, I see these theodicies and I see them as very plausible. So I think my position now would be that extreme suffering is equally probable on atheism and theism. But I mean, even if it wasn't, like, you know, I obviously I'm a theist. Like, I think that there's very good evidence for theism. So that's kind of my thoughts.
Yeah, I'll completely agree with you on that one. I don't necessarily think that suffering is perhaps more in favor of atheism than theism, because I mean we do see examples of extreme suffering in the Bible. For example, the book of Job, which is it Job or Job? I never knew.
Job. I mean, us Americans say Job. So
yes, well, it's in the book of Job, and there's a lot of suffering there, but I don't necessarily think that it's a extreme problem against the existence of God, and there's actually good reason to believe that sometimes extreme suffering is allowed by God, and that's not necessarily a huge, and it's not necessarily something which is like, okay, if extreme suffering, like God would not allow extreme suffering. I don't necessarily think that that's the case, because we have good, because like of course we have a lot of theodicies, and it's also extreme suffering is often used as and I think soul building can work with extreme sufferings in some situations, not all of them, but definitely in some situations where you genuinely see great things coming from extreme suffering. And I know a guy in Africa who's been absolutely hit by COVID, like really, really hard. Like he's gone from having rarely struggling to put 3 meals on his table to be struggling to put 2 meals on his table, and it's really hit him really, really hard, his family and stuff like that. And his relationship with God got stronger despite that. I would classify that as somewhat extreme suffering. I mean, maybe it's not extreme suffering, but I think it's quite up there, not being able to put food on your table. That's quite bad. And his relationship with God got way better from it. And I think that's perhaps a good reason for soul building.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, so my sister spent time in Zambia. I've been there, and like there's intense suffering, like horrific suffering that goes on there. And those people are so much more reliant on God, so much more faith. They don't look as like extreme suffering as evidence against the existence of God. They see it as like reasons to even grow closer to God. So I kind of wonder, like, I think that like when you get into like when we read like, you know, some of these stories, it's terrible. And the emotional appeal is like really, it really pulls to like, well, how could God ever allow, like, there's no reason that God would allow this on an emotional appeal. But then I think once we get like pen to paper, I don't know. I just don't find the arguments from evil that convincing once we get into like the actual like pen to paper form.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that.
Really tough question says, why would God allow rationality rules videos to show up in my recommended?
Oh man. Those sometimes come up on my recommended as well, and I'm sometimes tempted to look at them, but at the same time I don't look at too many atheist videos on the internet these days.
Yeah, I've been finding channels, like a lot of the channels disappoint me, but there's been some, like the Non-Alchemist has a really good channel. Counter Apologetics by Emerson Green's a good channel. You know, all the Apologetics Chad say Relay Theology is a good channel. Like there's good channels coming out, but I mean Rationality Rules definitely not my go-to. That's about all we have, Josh. So thank you for waking up, and good luck with the rest of your day. I hope you make it. I'm gonna go to bed soon and wake up and watch the Champions League final. But yeah, do you have any kind of like last thoughts you want to say before we wrap things up here?
Not really. Always an absolute pleasure to be here. Great to be on the channel to talk about things. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it was so much fun. And the Non-Alchemist, if you listen to this, my guy, you're pretty cool. Like the video, and I hope you found this edifying, and you know, just hopefully like furthering the dialogue, exchanging ideas, seeking truth. Thank you everyone who tuned in. Thank you Jesus, That One Gamer, Jonas with C, everyone else. Have a good one, and God bless.